Once upon a time, in the bustling Igbo village of Eziyama, there lived a man named Somadina. He was the epitome of wealth and tradition, born into a family whose riches rivaled those of royalty. Somadina was tall and commanding, his mere presence enough to make villagers stop mid-conversation. Yet beneath his polished exterior lay a mind poisoned by toxic beliefs, a legacy of his upbringing. His mother, Neoma, was a woman scarred by years of submission and abuse. Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of deep-rooted pain, and it was she who became the architect of her son's perception of women. "A woman is a stranger," she would tell him repeatedly, her words edged with bitterness. "She is an outsider who will one day try to come between you and your true family. A real man," she would say, leaning closer for emphasis, "takes charge of his home and never lets a woman drive a wedge between him and his kin." These lessons, born from her own pain and mistrust, became Somadina's compass as he grew into adulthood. Being the only son of an influential family, Somadina had his pick of admirers. Women flocked to him, enchanted by his wealth, status, and the effortless confidence he exuded. But Somadina, intoxicated by his superiority complex, dismissed them all with an air of indifference. In his mind, women were not equals, but distractions, outsiders who had no place in his life beyond fleeting amusement. One sweltering afternoon, as the sun blazed mercilessly over the sprawling farmlands of Eziyama, Somadina made his way to his family's farm. The farm was vast, a symbol of their affluence, and Somadina rarely set foot there unless it was to inspect the workers. But that day, fate had something else in store for him. As he approached the edge of the farm, his attention was drawn to a young woman, her slender frame moving swiftly through the fields. She was dressed simply, her wrapper tied securely around her waist, and beads of sweat clung to her glowing skin as she worked with practiced efficiency. He had never seen her before, but something about her movements caught his attention. Before he could call out to her, another figure, a young boy, came sprinting towards her, shouting urgently. She paused, her hands trembling as she listened to the boy. Then, without a moment's hesitation, she dropped her tools and began to run. Her footsteps were hurried, her breath quickened as panic painted her face. Somadina, intrigued by the sudden commotion, stepped into her path just as she was about to pass. She collided with him, her face a mask of worry as she gasped, "I'm so sorry." Without waiting for his response, she attempted to sidestep him and continue running after the boy. But Somadina was not one to be brushed aside so easily. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist with an air of authority. "So, this is how you flirt with men, eh?" he taunted, his voice dripping with condescension. "You bump into them, apologize, and then run off to make them chase you?" The woman's eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and urgency. She pulled her wrist free with surprising strength, her voice firm as she snapped, "Let me go! My mother is sick!" Without sparing him another glance, she turned and ran, her figure disappearing into the distance as Somadina stood frozen in place. For the first time in his life, Somadina was left speechless. The women he encountered always sought his attention, their every word and action calculated to impress him. But this woman, this bold, determined stranger, had not only ignored his insult, but had also refused to be ensnared by his charm. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, and her defiance sparked a fire within him. As he watched her fade into the horizon, a smirk tugged at the corners of his lips. The audacity of this woman intrigued him, and he found himself consumed by a singular thought. He would make her his. Not because he loved her, not because he needed her, but because she was the first woman who didn't throw herself at his feet. And Somadina was a man who always got what he wanted. As Chizaram disappeared into the distance, her feet pounding against the dirt road, Somadina stood rooted in place, his curiosity burning. He wasn't used to being dismissed, especially by a woman. The air around him crackled with the realization that she was unlike anyone he had encountered before. Turning to his trusted bodyguard, Okichukwu, he issued a sharp command. "Follow her. I want to know everything about her, where she lives, who her family is, and why she's in such a hurry." Okichukwu nodded and slipped away silently, blending into the background like a shadow. Meanwhile, Chizaram raced through the village, her heart hammering with fear and worry. Her mother's condition had worsened, and she couldn't afford to waste another second. She arrived at the healer's hut, her voice trembling as she begged, "Please, Nwanyama, come quickly. My mother is not getting better." The elderly healer, her face lined with years of wisdom and compassion, grabbed her basket of herbs and followed Chizaram back to her modest home. Inside the small, dimly lit hut, the air was heavy with desperation. The healer examined the frail woman lying on a mat, and after a moment, prepared a mixture of herbs. Handing it to Chizaram, she spoke gently but firmly. "This will ease her pain for now," Nwanyama said, her eyes filled with concern. "But your mother needs more than my remedies. She must be taken to the new clinic the white men have built in the community. They have the tools and medicine to help her." Chizaram's heart sank. The clinic, though a blessing to the village, came with a price she couldn't afford. She thanked the healer, her voice heavy with gratitude, and watched her leave. For a moment, she stood by her mother's side, brushing back strands of her graying hair, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Then, resolute, she returned to the farm. If she worked harder, perhaps she could save enough money for her mother's treatment. Meanwhile, Okachukwu observed everything from a careful distance. He noted the worn state of Chizaram's home, the urgency in her steps, and the tenderness with which she cared for her ailing mother. That evening, he returned to Somadina, painting a vivid picture of what he had seen. Somadina listened intently, leaning back in his chair as Okachukwu spoke. An idea began to form in his mind, one that brought a sly smile to his lips. He couldn't shake the image of Chizaram from his thoughts, her defiance and determination, a stark contrast to the women who usually surrounded him. "She's different," he murmured almost to himself. "I'll make her see me, not as a stranger, but as someone she can't resist." The next morning, Somadina made his way to the farm. He strolled through the fields, scanning for her familiar figure. When he finally saw her, bent over her work, he approached with an air of casual confidence. As noon approached, he sat down for lunch under the shade of a large tree. With a wave of his hand, he called out, "Come and eat with me." Chizaram glanced up briefly, her brow furrowed in confusion. "No, thank you," she replied curtly, returning to her work. Unfazed, Somadina stood and walked toward her. With a swift motion, he seized her hoe and held it over his shoulder. "If you won't eat with me," he teased, "then I suppose you won't need this." Her eyes narrowed as she stood, hands on her hips. "Give that back," she demanded. "Only if you eat with me," he said with a grin, his tone light but resolute. Chizaram let out an exasperated sigh, recognizing she had little choice. Reluctantly, she followed him to the tree and sat across from him. As they ate, he made small talk, asking her about her work, her family, and her life in the village. Though her answers were guarded, he found himself drawn to the quiet strength in her voice and the intelligence in her eyes. Over the days that followed, this became a pattern. Somadina began visiting the farm daily, always finding a reason to talk to her, to share a meal, or to offer assistance. Slowly, Chizaram started to see a different side of him, one that was kind, attentive, and surprisingly thoughtful. He was unlike the arrogant man she had first met, but a nagging feeling lingered in her mind. There was something about him, an air of hidden motives that she couldn't shake. As much as she appreciated his kindness, a voice in her head warned her, this man could bring trouble. Yet, as their conversations grew longer and their silences more comfortable, she couldn't help but wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to him than met the eye. Chizaram had made a solemn promise to herself. She would never fall for Somadina. No matter how kind or attentive he seemed, no matter how deeply his presence infiltrated her daily life, she knew better than to trust a man of his stature. As time passed, however, it became clear that Somadina's intentions were far from fleeting. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the fields with hues of gold, Somadina approached her with a look of determination. "I want you to be my wife," he said, his voice steady and confident. Chizaram froze. She had anticipated many things from him, but a marriage proposal wasn't one of them. Panic flickered in her eyes before she quickly masked it with a polite smile. "Soma, I can't," she replied softly, lowering her gaze. "I wouldn't fit into your life. You come from wealth and privilege, and I'm just a poor farmer's daughter. Our worlds are too different." Her refusal stung, but Somadina was not a man who gave up easily. He opened his mouth to argue, to persuade her, but before he could utter a word, a boy came sprinting toward them. Breathless and frantic, the boy shouted, "Auntie Chizara, your mother, she's having another attack. I called the healer, but she said she can't stabilize her. She must be taken to the clinic immediately." Chizara's heart stopped. For a moment, the world around her blurred as panic gripped her. She tried to gather her thoughts, but before she could act, Somadina took control. He signaled to his bodyguard, Okachukwu, who instantly sprang into action. "Follow the boy and ensure her mother gets to the clinic," he ordered, his voice firm. Then, turning to Chizara, he gently placed a hand on her arm. "We'll follow behind. Don't worry, I'll take care of everything." True to his word, Somadina did not leave Chizara's side. Together, they arrived at the clinic, where her mother, Adaugo, was admitted and treated. The days that followed were tense, filled with whispered prayers and sleepless nights. But thanks to the clinic's care and Somadina's unwavering support, Adaugo's health improved. The shadow of death lifted, and life returned to her frail body. Chizara was overcome with gratitude. She knew she could never repay Somadina for what he had done, and her mother made sure to remind her of it every day. "Soma is a good man," Adaugo would say, her voice laced with admiration. "A man who steps in during your darkest hour is a rare gem. Marry him, my daughter. He is your destiny." At first, Chizara resisted. She told herself that her gratitude shouldn't translate into love. But the walls around her heart began to weaken under the combined force of her mother's praises and Somadina's relentless charm. Eventually, she gave in, convincing herself that perhaps this was fate. The wedding was the event of the year. Eziama buzzed with excitement as word spread that Somadina, the most eligible bachelor in the land, was marrying a simple farmer's daughter. The villagers whispered in awe about Chizara's good fortune, and young women envied her fiercely. "She's living every girl's dream," they said. "Imagine marrying a man like Somadina, handsome, wealthy, and powerful." For a while, Chizara basked in the glow of her new life. Her marriage to Somadina seemed picture-perfect. He treated her like a queen, showering her with gifts and affection. The villagers spoke of their union as a fairy tale come to life. But fairy tales, as Chizara would soon learn, often have a darker side. Beneath Somadina's charming exterior lay the remnants of his deeply ingrained beliefs. The toxic mindset that women were outsiders, unworthy of true respect. The cracks in his carefully constructed facade began to show. Chizaram rose before dawn, her movements swift and precise as she tackled the day's chores. Her hands expertly scrubbed the courtyard, and she hummed softly to herself, the sound a comforting rhythm to her work. Her mother, Adaugo, often watched her with pride, marveling at her daughter's resilience and grace despite the hardships they faced. Today was no different. After ensuring breakfast was prepared and the compound spotless, Chizaram wrapped her colorful scarf around her head, grabbed her basket, and prepared to head to the farm. Her steps were purposeful, but her mind wandered to a brighter future. She had always dreamed of a loving husband, a peaceful home, and the joy of raising her children in harmony. As she reached the gate, Somadina appeared, leaning casually against the wooden post. His tall frame and commanding presence seemed to fill the space, and his confident smile made her pause. "Good morning, Chizaram," he greeted, his voice smooth and warm. Chizaram offered a polite nod. "Good morning, Soma. I'm on my way to the farm." Somadina stepped forward, his gaze softening as he gently took the basket from her hands. "No," he said firmly but kindly. "You don't need to do that anymore." Chizaram blinked in surprise. "But the farm needs tending." "You're my wife now," Soma said, his tone filled with conviction. "I will take care of you and your mother. There's no need for you to toil under the sun anymore." "But Soma," she began, her voice hesitant. "No arguments," he interrupted, his smile widening. "I've hired workers to handle the farm. From now on, your only concern should be your happiness and our home." Chizaram hesitated, unsure how to process the sudden shift in her life. Soma reached into a bag, slung over his shoulder, and pulled out a wrapped parcel. "Here," he said, holding it out to her. "This is for your mother." "For my mother?" Chizaram's eyes widened as she accepted the package. Inside were fine fabrics and a basket of provisions, rice, beans, and yams, items they often struggled to afford. "She deserves to be cared for," Soma said, his voice softening. "And so do you." I'll make sure both of you never lack anything." Chizaram felt her defenses crumble under his words. This man, who had already done so much for her family, seemed too good to be true. A smile tugged at her lips as she looked at him. "Thank you, Soma," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. When Chizaram presented the gifts to her mother, Adalgo's joy was uncontainable. She clapped her hands in delight, her weathered face lighting up with a smile. "This Somadina is a blessing," she said, her voice brimming with praise. "You found a good man, my daughter. Cherish him." Soma's actions continued to endear him to the family. He would visit often, bringing more gifts and ensuring that Adalgo had everything she needed. His charm was undeniable, and his promises of care and love seemed genuine. He became the picture-perfect son-in-law, winning the hearts of everyone around him. One evening, Soma and Chizaram sat under the large mango tree in the compound. The air was cool, and the faint sounds of crickets filled the silence. Soma reached for her hand, his touch firm yet gentle. "Do you know why I fell in love with you?" he asked, his voice low and intimate. Chizaram shook her head, her cheeks flushing. "Why?" "Because of your strength and kindness," he said, looking into her eyes. "You've faced so much, yet you remain cheerful and hardworking. I want to be the man who lifts your burdens and gives you the life you deserve." Chizaram felt her heart swell at his words. She had always carried the weight of her family's struggles alone, but now here was a man promising to share that load. "You've already done so much," she said softly. "Thank you." Soma smiled, leaning closer. "This is only the beginning. I'll show you every day how much you mean to me." As the days turned into weeks, Chizaram's life seemed to transform. Soma's love and attention enveloped her like a warm embrace, and her mother's newfound comfort brought her peace. She began to believe that her dreams of a happy marriage were finally coming true. But beneath Soma's charming exterior lay an unspoken tension. There were moments, fleeting but noticeable, when his smile didn't quite reach his eyes, or when his tone carried a hint of possessiveness. Chizaram dismissed these as mere quirks, too enamored with the life he was building for her to question his intentions. Unbeknownst to her, the foundation of their relationship was being built on sand, and the storm that would test its strength was already gathering on the horizon. Life in Chizaram's home began to change subtly after Somadina's mother, Neoma, moved in. At first, her presence seemed harmless, almost welcoming. She would sit on the veranda, chatting about the village and occasionally offering Chizaram advice on pregnancy and household management. But as the days passed, her demeanor shifted from motherly guidance to quiet dominance. Somadina, who had once doted on Chizaram, now seemed to defer more to his mother. It was subtle, an instruction here, a decision there, but the message was clear: Neoma was taking control. Chizaram's days began long before sunrise. One such morning, she tied her wrapper tightly around her waist, grabbed the clay pot, and began the arduous trek to Azudo River. The path was steep, littered with loose stones, and the early morning mist clung to her skin like a cold embrace. The sound of the waterfall roared in the distance, but instead of feeling peace, Chizaram felt a growing heaviness in her heart. By the time she reached the river, her arms ached and her feet throbbed. She filled the pot with water and balanced it carefully on her head. The return journey was even more grueling. Every step felt like a test of her endurance, and by the time she reached the compound, her strength was nearly spent. She carefully set the pot down in the corner and straightened up, only to hear Neoma's sharp voice. "Chizaram, you're back," Neoma called from her seat on the veranda. "Good. Go and wash the clothes I left in the corner. And don't forget my wrappers. They must be spotless." Chizaram nodded silently, her body screaming for rest. She didn't dare argue. Neoma's sharp tongue was sharper than any blade. The chores seemed never-ending. After washing the clothes, she swept the compound, cooked breakfast, and ensured that Somadina's needs were met. Her own meals were often hurried bites in between tasks. Her pregnancy, instead of earning her leniency, seemed to amplify the expectations placed upon her. One night, after an especially exhausting day, Chizaram prepared a simple dinner of yam porridge, hoping it would suffice. She served Neoma and Somadina, then retreated to the kitchen to rest. Moments later, Neoma's voice rang out, cutting through the quiet evening. "Chizaram!" Chizaram hurried to the living room, her heart racing. "Yes, Mama?" "This food," Naoma said, pushing her plate aside. "It's not what I feel like eating. I want pounded yam and onyugbu soup." Chizaram hesitated. "But Mama, it's already late, and Are you arguing with me?" Naoma interrupted, her voice icy. "You think because you're carrying a child, you can disrespect me?" "No, Mama," Chizaram said quickly, lowering her gaze. "I'll make it now." She spent the next hour pounding yam, her arms trembling with every strike of the mortar. The smell of the bitter leaf soup filled the kitchen, but Chizaram felt no hunger, only exhaustion. When she finally served the meal, Naoma barely acknowledged her efforts, and Somadina said nothing, his eyes fixed on his plate. Late that night, Chizaram sat on the edge of her bed, her hands resting on her swollen belly. She could feel the baby's gentle kicks, a reminder of the life growing inside her. But instead of joy, she felt a deep sadness. The home she had once dreamed of was now a place of endless toil and silent suffering. Somadina entered the room and noticed her troubled expression. "What's wrong?" he asked, his tone more curious than concerned. "Nothing," she replied quickly, forcing a smile. She had learned that voicing her concerns often led to more trouble than it was worth. But in her heart, she longed for the days when his promises of love and care felt genuine. Now, she felt like an outsider in her own home, her needs and feelings overshadowed by Naoma's dominance and Somadina's growing indifference. The story of Chizaram's life had become one of quiet endurance. Every task, every word, every gesture seemed designed to remind her of her place. But beneath her obedient exterior, a storm of emotions brewed: frustration, sadness, and a faint glimmer of defiance. One evening, after a long and exhausting day, Chizaram sat quietly by the kitchen fire, her hands trembling from fatigue. The day had been grueling, fetching water from Ezudo River, washing piles of clothes, cooking multiple meals, and enduring her mother-in-law's constant complaints. Her swollen feet ached, and her back felt like it might give way. Still, she summoned her courage, determined to speak to Soma about the burden she could no longer bear. After ensuring that everyone had eaten and the compound was spotless, she approached Soma, who was reclining on a woven mat in the parlor. His expression was calm, and she took this as a sign that he might be willing to listen. "Soma," she began softly, her voice hesitant but steady. "I know Mama is your mother, and I respect her so much. She's done so much for this family, and I don't mean to complain, but the tasks she gives me, they're becoming overwhelming. I barely have time to rest, and with the baby coming soon." She placed a protective hand on her growing belly. "I worry it might not be good for the child. Please, can you speak to her for me?" For a moment, Soma remained silent. Then his eyes narrowed and his jaw tightened. "How dare you?" he said, his voice low but seething with anger. He sat up, his movement sharp and deliberate. "How dare you talk about my mother like that? Do you know what she went through to raise me? To give me the life I have now?" Chizaram took a step back, her heart pounding. "I didn't mean any disrespect, Soma. You just what?" Soma roared, cutting her off. "You think you can come into this house and dictate how things should be done? You're my wife. You will do what my mother says without complaints, or you can leave." Tears welled up in Chizaram's eyes as she shook her head. "I have nowhere else to go," she whispered. "Then act like it," he shouted, his hands striking her with such force that she stumbled backward. The room spun as she clutched her cheek, the sting of his slap burning both her skin and her soul. That night, Soma beat her for the first time, his anger spilling over into violence. When it was over, Chizaram lay curled on the floor, her body aching and her spirit shattered. She realized then that the man who had once promised to care for her was gone, replaced by someone she no longer recognized. In the days that followed, Soma's treatment of Chizaram grew harsher. Any perceived slight, a delayed meal, a misplaced item, or even a weary look became an excuse for his anger. The beatings became more frequent, and Chizaram learned to tread carefully, avoiding any action that might provoke him. But what hurt more than the physical pain was the isolation. Soma began visiting her mother, Adaugo, regularly, spinning tales of Chizaram's supposed ingratitude. "I've done everything for her," he would say, shaking his head in feigned sorrow. "I care for her. I provide for her. and yet she treats me with such disrespect. I don't know what more I can do." Hidalgo, blinded by Soma's charm and generosity, believed every word. So, when Chizaram finally gathered the courage to confide in her mother, she was met with disbelief. "Chizaram," Hidalgo said, her tone firm, "you should be grateful to have a husband like Soma. Do you know how many women would envy your life? Maybe if you were more respectful, things would be better." Chizaram's heart broke at her mother's words. She felt trapped, with no one to turn to and no escape in sight. Months later, Chizaram went into labor. The pain was intense, but she bore it silently, her cries muffled by her determination to endure. When her first son, Arinze, was born, a fleeting moment of joy filled her heart. She held the tiny baby in her arms, marveling at his small fingers and soft cries. Somadina, however, was indifferent. "Good," he said when the midwife announced the birth. "A son to carry on my name." There was no tenderness in his tone, no shared joy in the new life they had created. He left the room moments later, leaving Chizaram alone with her child. Despite Soma's coldness, Chizaram poured all her love into Arinze. He became her source of strength, her reason to endure the hardships of her marriage. As the years went by, Chizaram gave birth to 4 more children, 3 boys and a girl. By this time, Neoma had passed away, but her absence did little to change Soma's behavior. If anything, he became harsher, treating Chizaram as an outsider in her own home. The chores were endless, and the beatings continued. Chizaram's children grew up witnessing their father's treatment of her. At first, they were confused and even angry. "Why does Papa hurt Mama?" Arinze asked one day, his young face filled with concern. "It's just how things are," Chizaram replied, her voice heavy with resignation. She didn't have the heart to explain further. As the children grew older, they began to accept Soma's behavior as normal. Arinze, in particular, started to emulate his father, believing that dominance and control were signs of strength. Chizaram watched in silent despair as the cycle she had hoped to break took root in her own family. Through it all, Chizaram endured. She focused on her children, teaching them kindness and respect whenever Soma wasn't around. She found moments of peace in their laughter and fleeting moments of joy in their achievements. But deep down, she knew that the life she had dreamed of was forever out of reach. If you're eager to find out how Chizaram's unwavering resilience shapes her children's future, stay tuned for part 2 of this gripping tale. Will her children continue down the same destructive path as their father, or is there hope for change? Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter of the story. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think the cycle of dominance and control can be broken? Or are the children destined to repeat Soma's mistakes? Leave your predictions in the comments below, and if you found this story captivating, give this video a thumbs up. Your support means everything to us and helps us keep bringing these powerful African folktales to life. Thanks for watching African Folktales by Nychi. We can't wait to share the next part of Chizaram's story with you.